Climate change is one of four pillars of the 100 Days Plan that dates all the way back to the transition program that was announced shortly after the election, and really represents unprecedented action by an administration in the early days on climate change. So climate, is one of these four core cornerstones, if you will, of what the administration is focused on, along with COVID, the economy, and equity. In terms of interagency collaboration, we're really seeing a shift to what they're calling a whole of government approach. So you can see this reflected in the creation of a new Office of Domestic Climate Policy. The former EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, is going to run that new office. Really puts climate on par with national security and economic policy in terms of the focus at the White House. In addition, there's a National Climate Task Force that the Climate Policy Office will run that involves 21 different federal agencies. And they're really charged with cooperation, trying to ensure that there's interagency partnership across the government focused on climate action. And interestingly, the executive order specifically calls out engaging with local governments and communities on climate and resilience as part of the work of this task force. We also saw the creation of a new working group on coal and power plant communities and economic revitalization. This group is designed to come up with new policy proposals to help communities with the transition to a clean energy economy. And we expect that there'll be a number of specific proposals that come out of that federal working group designed to support those communities who may be dependent on fossil fuel industries in the economy. There were a lot of actions related to environmental justice as part of this overall push on climate change, including a new White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council. This group is charged with creating a new federal environmental justice strategy that includes performance measures. So in addition to cooperation across agencies and the development of policies, they're really trying to come up with specific performance measures that would guide a range of outcomes across agencies. And again, much like the National Climate Task Force, there was an explicit call for cooperation and consultation with local governments, local leaders, and nonprofits on this aspect of the work. And then another aspect of changing the sort of structural approach to climate change is this idea of reinstating efforts to advance what's known as the social cost of carbon, and working to infuse that into the regulatory process across agencies, so that whenever a new regulation or guidance was coming out of a federal agency, there would be a social cost of carbon lens applied to that regulatory action. So you can sort of see that the issue of climate, the issue of environmental justice really being elevated through these structural changes with the intention of having a whole of government approach. Another facet of the executive orders on climate change relate to targets and goals. One of the critical components is the charge for all federal agencies and departments to create climate action plans. These plans would be designed to focus on the data that those agencies produce that can help improve their own efforts at adaptation and resilience, sort of aiming at getting the federal house in order, in addition to providing support to states and localities. So we expect these climate action plans would be among the early actions that we would see across the federal government. Worth remembering too, that even though it was in a different executive order, the one signed on the first day of the administration, that the U.S. Committed to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. Part of that, and this is what relates to the targets and goals section of these actions, is that in order to rejoin, the United States has to revisit a number of the requirements in the agreement that relate to our own goal setting and our own standards and targets for meeting the goals established in the Paris Agreement. So that work is now being kicked off. And keep in mind that with the creation of this Domestic Climate Council, there's a domestic focus inside the White House, but there's also an international focus being led by former Secretary of State John Kerry. So you've got the international and the domestic working hand in hand in terms of a focus on climate. There's some other key targets also established in the executive order, including one to conserve 30% of U.S. land and water by 2030, a mandate specifically to federal land management agencies and environmental protection related agencies to hit that 30% target. They'll put a plan in place for getting there by 2030. Another number target here, the Justice 40 initiative. This is part of the environmental justice section of the executive order. It establishes a goal that 40% of the benefits of federal investment should flow to disadvantaged communities, and charges agencies with coming up with a system to measure that so that the benefits are quantified and there's an understanding of whether or not those investments are indeed benefiting targeted environmental justice communities. And then lastly, in this section, there's direction to update the existing environmental justice policies and orders that are already on the book. Some of these date to the Clinton administration. And so there's now an intentional process to go back and update the entire portfolio of environmental justice orders and policies across the federal government. And so the third category of actions relative to planning from the executive orders on climate change relate to tools specifically for local communities, tools for good planning. A task force is being created through the executive order to develop a specific proposal on a consolidated federal mapping service. This has been in the works for a while, or at least in conversation for a while. This would move it forward. And the mapping service would be specifically charged with aiding state, local, and regional climate planning, including improving access to forecasting data and modeling related to climate-related changes. This would affect the entire portfolio of federal agencies that deal with data and mapping. So significant change there, and significant new tool potentially being created. Secondly, within 6 months of the signing of this order, the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House is charged with creating a geospatial climate and economic justice screening tool that includes interactive maps. Again, the aim here is to provide data tools for local decision makers and planners to help folks understand sort of the spatial implications for climate and economic justice, to allow that to drive things like infrastructure investment decisions and other federal actions that can affect local communities. There's also an effort to launch new regulatory work across a whole range of topics, clean energy and other things. But there's specifically one related to building standards, clean energy, green building standards. That regulatory work will be kicked off immediately and is likely to lead to not only the standard side, but also new tools aimed at helping communities reach those targets. And of course, previously in order signed prior to this collection of actions on climate change was an order directing CEQ to reconsider the NEPA overhaul that was part of the Trump administration's approach over the last couple of years, rescinds that guidance and launches a new regulatory process. And there was action also taken to reinstate an Obama-era policy related to flood resiliency standards for federal infrastructure. So a number of new tools for local communities, new standards for local communities embedded in the executive orders that were launched last week. So there are a host of impacts of these executive orders directly for planners, planning, and communities. Looking broadly, I would say there's a real shift to a stronger regulatory approach from the federal government on climate and resiliency. As there's been debate over the last few years about how best to tackle climate change, there's sort of a spectrum from incentives and pricing to regulation. I think these executive orders certainly move toward a stronger regulatory approach across the federal government. Secondly, the whole idea of a whole of government approach and a lot of the structural changes that you see in terms of how agencies work together, some of the requirements on agencies and some of these new structures based inside the White House, you really see an effort to integrate federal actions and actors. So when planners think about their engagement, or communities think about their engagement with individual federal agencies, the goal here would be for there to be a closer collaboration and for there to be a stronger sense of integration, so that one agency isn't undermining the work of another agency who's running a different program, but there would be a more consistent approach that communities could understand and plan around. Thirdly, there's real opportunity here, I think, for planning to lead. When you look at the targets that are being set, the drive to provide tools for local decision making, there's a clear undercurrent here of the idea that planning can set the stage. Planning can provide the targets, the measurements on an ongoing basis, the regular evaluation, and that those actions can then drive the investments and the funding. And that's, I think, exactly the sort of opportunity that planning is poised to embrace. There's also a strong administration push around electric vehicles and clean energy. It's not called out directly in all of these executive orders, but it is certainly there in the platform that they're building and the proposals that they're putting in place. And I think that will place both demands and opportunities on planning to think about the land use and the infrastructure requirements in order to make that reality possible. So we'll see that happen not only through these executive orders, but then the translation into other pieces of policy action and even legislation. And that leads me to sort of the final point here, which is that they're both opportunities without Congress through these executive orders for the federal government to lead on climate change and to promote resiliency at the local level. But there are going to be future opportunities with Congress as we look at recovery legislation, transportation reauthorization, other sorts of opportunities in the legislative process to link these executive orders to funding streams and appropriations and other kinds of key programs that drive local actions.